From the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, I'm Stewart Patrick, and this is The World Unpacked. This fall, humanity passed a major milestone. The world's population topped 8 billion people. That's a mind-boggling number, and it could have big implications for the global economy, for geopolitics, for social stability, and for the health of the planet. Today, we'll be discussing current demographic trends and ask how population patterns will shape the world that our children and our grandchildren will inherit. To help us make sense of it all, we have with us one of the world's leading political demographers, Jack Goldstone. Jack is a professor and eminent scholar at George Mason University, where he holds the Virginia E. and John T. Hazel Chair in Public Policy. He's also a prolific author and commentator on the links between demographic change, political stability, and world politics, among other topics. Jack, welcome to The World Unpacked.
So good to be here. Good to see you.
Yeah, no, wonderful to see you again, Jack. Well, let's dive right in. And I'd like to begin with asking just how significant this milestone is. I mean, on the one hand, it seems like a huge deal. 12,000 years ago, before the agricultural revolution, humans numbered only about 4 or 5 million, about the size of Seattle or Casablanca today. And as recently as 1800, there were only about 1 billion people. From another perspective, though, you could argue that 8 billion is pretty arbitrary. It may be a symbolic figure, but maybe it's a little bit like the Dow crossing 30,000. How should we think about this moment?
I think it's good to use this moment to take stock of all the different population changes that are happening in our world and what their impact will be. Thinking about that overall number, however, can be a bit of a distraction. Yeah, we had a huge increase in global population from about 1 billion in 1800 to over 6 billion at the beginning of this century. It's already grown up to 8 billion. But that number doesn't really tell you what the important things are that are happening. That's because if you say, well, we were at 6 billion a few decades ago, now we're at 8 billion, that's a 33% increase in a few decades. That's significant. But there are other things happening that are equally or even more important. For example, the fact that the aging population, for the first time in human history, is becoming a significant part of the total population and even more significant relative to the young population. For the first time ever in human society, we're going to have countries where the number of people over 65 is larger than the number of people under 25. And because it's never happened before, we have no idea how to deal with that. We have other countries where population growth is continuing to be very rapid, so much so that more than half their population is under 25. And the world is going topsy-turvy in terms of the relationship of different parts. 1950, Europe's population was relatively large compared to Africa, even South Asia. And by the time our kids are in their prime adulthood, population of North America and Europe will actually be small compared to that in those other regions. So I want to talk today not just about that 8 billion number, although it's quite significant for our environment and for our planet, but also about what's happening in particular places.
That's a terrific opening for our discussion to really begin to unpack this sort of overall number and look at some of the divergences that are happening around the world. I want to stick just for a second with overall global trends, though. In recent decades, it's kind of fascinating. The population growth has actually slowed quite sharply at a global level. And from what I understand, we may be on the verge of peak child, which is where the overall number of babies born actually begins to fall. But it's a little unclear at this point when and at what figure the world's overall population will actually level off. From what I've seen, the UN has suggested nearly 2100 as the date that overall population finally levels off at nearly 11 billion. And then others say much earlier, maybe 9.5, 9.6 billion in the 2060s. What accounts for these different estimates, and does it matter how quickly humanity makes this demographic transition?
Well, anybody can pull out a chalkboard and make assumptions about how many children will be born in different countries over the next 30, 40, 50 years. I believe the UN was very precise, saying that world population would peak at, I think, 10.74 billion in 2074, something like that. But that's completely, arbitrary. We have no idea. We can't pretend to be that specific. But here's what happens with these different estimates. Let's assume, for example, that the population of Africa will become more educated and follow the same declining fertility path as countries in East Asia and South Asia. If that happens, then global population growth will probably level off below 10 billion sometime after 2050. On the other hand, population fertility in Africa, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, has been pretty stable. It really hasn't fallen very much over the last 20, 30 years. What's really happened is huge improvements in infant mortality in that region. The work of the Gates Foundation, work on AIDS, all kinds of great work on various tropical diseases and childhood diseases. It's meant that any decline in fertility has just about been offset by gains in life expectancy, especially for small children. So population growth in Africa, if that continues at the same pace as today, global population could hit 12 billion by the end of the century and still keep growing. Here's what we know. For the next 30 years, most of the population growth that we expect is pretty much baked in. And the reason is we can count the number of people today who are under 25. We know that for the next 50 years, those people will be the bulk of global population. And we know roughly how many children young people are having now. And we don't expect that to change suddenly or dramatically in the future. So we can make pretty good estimates of global population, say out to 2050. But beyond that, what happens really depends on what we choose to do today. If the world gets together and says we want to help young women in South Asia and Africa have more control over their lives, more earning opportunities, and help them decide if they want to have smaller families. If they make that choice, if we make that choice easy and attractive by incorporating those regions in the global economy, then there's a good chance that population growth will level off shortly after 2050. On the other hand, if we say to these regions, we meaning the rich world, if we say, hey, we don't want your immigrants, we don't want your students, we don't want you to pick up skills from us, we're kind of going to wall ourselves off from what we see as an area of lots of dangerous young people, and you're pretty much on your own, then people will continue to rely on family and kinship as the main way to protect themselves against the dangers of life. And if they do that, they'll invest in family and kinship, which means having larger families. That's the natural thing to do. And if that's the case, then we're probably well off to 12 billion or more, and who knows what happens beyond. But the choices we make today, that will determine how many young women we have in the world in the 2060s and 2070s, and how many children they find desirable to have. So we can't do much to change the next 30 years, but what we do today will have a huge impact on whether population stabilizes or continues to take off in the second half of this century.
Before we get on to sort of some of the public policy ramifications of this and the dilemmas this poses both at the national level and at the conceivably at the multilateral level, let's get a little bit more specific to give our listeners a quick sense of some local trends, and perhaps we can do this in a somewhat rapid fire way. Let's start with Africa. You've already alluded to the fact that Africa seems to be the epicenter of population growth. What can we expect there, and is it from your view, is it pretty undifferentiated in terms of all being an epicenter of growth, or do you see some regional variation to obviously an enormous continent of 50-odd countries?
Yeah, Africa is a huge place. It's got 54 different countries. Some of them, like Mauritius, have already achieved very low fertility, but Mauritius is a very small place. It's an island country. The biggest countries in Africa, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Uganda, Democratic Republic of Congo, are also, for the most part, the fastest growing. And that's what makes Africa such a big player in global population change for the future. It's the biggest countries that are growing the fastest, and where fertility has fallen to relatively low levels, that tends to be in much smaller, less important countries. They don't have a big impact for the future. It's really what will happen in West Africa, Central Africa, parts of East Africa, maybe even North Africa. Egypt, which had kind of stabilized its population, has in the past few years seen fertility go up. And if that trend spreads throughout North Africa, then that region also will be an important contributor to growth.
Let's shift to Asia if we can, and let's talk in particular about the two big demographic giants there. China and India now have about 1.4 billion people, and from what I understand, India in the next several months will pass China by most estimates. So they seem to be going, though, in somewhat different directions. How do their trajectories compare?
South Asia should be kind of viewed as a whole. India, of course, is the dominant population country there, 1.4 billion, but Pakistan and Bangladesh are also very large. Afghanistan is smaller, but growing very quickly. If you take those countries all together, what we see is we've had kind of spectacular growth from, say, 1950 to 2010. Population in that region more than tripled. But it's slowing down now. Especially, it's surprising to people, but India and Bangladesh have both achieved fertility rates pretty close to replacement. India, yes, did grow 1.4 billion. It's going to be the largest country in the world, but don't expect much more growth after that.
But what about China? With respect to China, the cliche, I think, has often been, will China sort of get rich before it gets old? And from what I gather, it's aging remarkably quickly.
China is such a demographic disaster that we haven't begun to really understand what is happening there. And neither, I think, has the Chinese government, although they're already starting to enter a situation of justified panic. Now, that may sound like I'm being extreme and alarmist and all of that, but the numbers are startling. Remember, China forcefully coerced the population into a one-child policy. Now, they were warned at the time. They were concerned about population growth. China's population had almost tripled from 1950 to 2000. And so they were concerned, oh my gosh, if that continues, what are we going to do? We're going to run out of food. We're going to run out of room. So they were really concerned. Now, in fact, fertility was already declining in China, but the one-child policy was pretty much like taking a gun to your head and pulling the trigger. It said to Chinese people, look, every couple is going to have only one child, and that means that one child, when they grow up, will have to care for two parents and four grandparents. That's a crazy situation, but somehow they didn't look ahead. And China has gotten rid of that one-child policy. They've said, hey, have two children, have three children. It's fine. We love it. We want to see it. But they're getting virtually no response. Fertility continues to fall. And the reason for that is pretty simple. China has educated its women, so women are in the workforce. They are not getting married because the life of a married woman in China is one where you're expected to work outside the home and still work intensively inside the home. And it's not a good deal for women. Because of the one-child policy, almost all of the apartments that have been built in China in the last 20 years are one-bedroom apartments, sometimes two-bedroom, but you'll almost never find a three-bedroom apartment or condo at any reasonable price anywhere in China. So how are people going to have two or three children? It's just not happening. So what happens if you simply assume that Chinese fertility will stay where it is? Well, total population will start to decline. It's already, by some measures, doing so. But let's say China's population peaks out at about 1.4 billion. It'll fall down to maybe 1.3 billion by 2050, not a big deal, but projection is it'll fall all the way down to barely a billion by 2070. So that's losing about a quarter of the population. So in the next 50 years, China is looking at a 50% decline in prime working age population. And that's why I say panic.
That is quite startling. Before we go to the break, I'd just really quickly ask you about how the United States stacks up in terms of its demographic future.
The United States was always laughing at the world because we remained a relatively young and growing population, even as China started to flip from fast-growing young to rapidly aging. And of course, Europe started to shift into a slow growth aging population as well. Japan, South Korea too. So for a long time, the United States seemed like the outlier, the happy outlier. But that is no longer the case because all of a sudden, after 2008, the immigrant fertility in the United States, which had always been kind of pushing our total fertility up, rapidly converged with that of the native born. So overall fertility in the United States has fallen well below replacement over the last dozen years. From 2008 to 2022, we've gone down to a fertility rate of about 1.75, I think, children per woman. So that's well below the 2 children per woman you need just to sustain population. And that's really a result of this convergence after the big recession in 2008, where basically now the United States looks much more like Europe, and immigrant families look much more like native-born families in terms of their fertility. Now, the U.S. also had more generous immigration than most European countries, but that's also turned around. Europe is getting more migrants, mainly from the Middle East and East Asia. And in just the last 2 or 3 years, legal immigration to the United States has virtually collapsed because of restrictions and manpower shortages and staffing the visa State Department programs. So that these 2 big drivers of population growth in the United States, that is relatively high fertility among recent immigrants and a large number of new immigrants, those have both gone away. And so now the United States is also looking at a shrinking workforce and fast aging population unless we go back to more generous immigration policies typical of the 60s and 70s.
That's fascinating, absolutely fascinating, not least about the United States, which is a story I had not heard in nearly the detail you've just described it. So when we come back, I'm going to ask Jack about the pressures these demographic trends are placing on countries, as well as their potential implications for geopolitics, the world economy, and the global environment. Hey, thanks for listening to The World Unpacked. We have a lot of fun putting on this show for y'all, but we can't do it without your help. To support the work we do here, please visit ceip.org/donate. Thanks. So, Jack, let's dig a bit more into the pressures that demographic trends, whether boom or bust, are placing on countries, including for growth, political stability, and migration. We often hear about the demographic dividend. What does that imply, and what do countries poised for major growth in terms of their populations actually need to do to benefit from it?
That's a very good question. The demographic dividend is a happy byproduct of population growth slowing down. The best way to think about this is if you have a population of a country that's been, historically poor and underdeveloped, it usually has a lot of young people, very few old people, and a high rate of mortality among the young. Now, let's say that society starts to get richer and starts to develop. What's going to happen? More young people are going to survive at first, but then as they have higher incomes and more opportunities to save and work, they usually start to have fewer children. And the reason is they're less reliant on kinship and family networks to provide contacts and take care of themselves. Instead, they rely on informal networks through their work, through their neighborhood, and they rely more on their own earnings and savings, which they can maximize if they have smaller families. So as the society goes through this, the number of people of prime working age grows because what were large numbers of children are now surviving, and they're entering their 20s and 30s and becoming productive workers. The number of old people, 60 and older, remains very small because very few people reached that age when the country was poor. And because the workers are having fewer children, they have fewer dependents to support. So the overall age structure goes from one that had lots and lots of kids and not that many healthy workers to an age structure that has lots and lots of healthy workers, not many old people, not so many young people. And that means the kind of average productivity for the population as a whole goes way, way, way up. Now, that assumes that those people of working age are able to find productive work. But if they can do so, you get a kind of big boost in the way the age structure supports the economy as a whole. That's called the demographic dividend. You get kind of a beautiful bulge of prime age workers and not too much else.
So if that's the general trend, there must be certain situational conditions that can make it or allow a country or facilitate its ability to actually take advantage of that dividend. One of the things that has been associated with countries with large youth populations has been some association, particularly with poor countries, with state instability and fragility and even state failure. Could you speak a little bit about how tight that linkage is? I know you've done a lot of work on state fragility in the past, and how this might play out in the future, because that obviously could be a major stumbling block to countries taking advantage of this sort of a dividend.
It helps in understanding how population growth affects political stability. It helps to think of a population as having kind of inputs and outputs. People enter a population by births and somewhat by migration, but mainly by births, and then they exit by deaths. For most of history, humanity lived in societies where the input and output were pretty much the same. That is, population growth was very, very, very slow because the number of people born pretty much matched the number of people who died, and population growth might be as small as 0.1% per year, maybe 1% over several decades. Now, in a situation like that, one way to simply ensure political stability is to say kids have to do what they've always done, namely follow in the footsteps of their parents. If you have the same kind of stable population and every child can aspire to fill the space of their parent when the parent dies, you have a very stable society, because essentially whatever distribution of goods and status you have is going to be reproduced over time. This is one reason why societies came up with things like hereditary nobility, the caste system in India, this kind of guarantee that kids follow into their parents' footsteps makes for a very stable, manageable society. Now, think about what happens if the input, the number of kids being born, starts to exceed the number of people who pass away, so that kind of every 20 years or so, you have a new input of youngsters entering the labor force, entering adulthood, that's larger than the cohort that preceded them. So now there are more kids than can fit into their parents' position. Well, you can't create more land. Land is usually pretty fixed. So you have to increase agricultural productivity and farm productivity for the agricultural population to achieve the same income. That's not easy to do. Some of that extra population is going to spill into cities, but then you're forcing cities to absorb a growth in population. And that's not always easy to do either. People are going to be looking for jobs, looking for housing. If they can't find it, they're going to be frustrated. And then in the elite families, you're going to have multiple kids who are expecting to have elite positions like their parents. So that puts pressure on the government to try and generate more elite positions. But that's also hard to do if you have more mouths to feed. So population growth, if sustained over a couple generations, creates a lot of pressure in the economy and on the political system to find places for young people. And the result throughout history has been when that pressure builds up, if it's not adequately met, then young people are easily drawn to radical ideologies and mobilized for protest or rebellion. So it really is a bad situation for state stability to have generation after generation of population growth if you can't provide enough additional economic space and political space to meet what people aspire to.
Now, aging societies have pressures, of course, on them as well, and you alluded to it in the case of China. But it's presumably this is going to be something that affects Western European countries that have do not have population replacement. Same thing with respect to the United States. How can aging societies address the labor force and fiscal effects of their own predicament? And is migration part of the answer to that? Are there other things that the governments can do to actually adjust to that? Because you would think that one solution to aging populations would be to welcome migrants from demographically younger nations. But obviously, as you're sort of alluding to, that can be, politically volatile, and because there are perceptions of social cohesion, et cetera. And then there's also the possibility of aging populations actually, in some cases, some of those people moving to other parts of the world as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, here's where you have to use your imagination. People tend to think of international immigration in terms of young people from Africa and Asia moving to rich places in Europe and North America. There is a lot of that, to be sure, but not as much as people think. One of the things that's surprising is that people just don't really know the demography of their own countries. Almost everywhere, people overestimate the number of immigrants and the numbers of minorities, often by huge numbers. For example, if you ask Americans, what's the percentage of Muslims living in America? They'll say 10%, 20%. The number is really like 3 to 4%. But as you say, there are a lot of people who have decided that life is better in retirement in places like Mexico, Peru, Ecuador, Panama, Costa Rica. Europeans, they moved to Portugal, southern Spain, but they would do better for their money if they could move to Tunisia, Morocco, Thailand. That's partly because what people who are in their senior years need is sunshine, lots of medical care, and frankly, lots of labor-intensive support. Countries that are aging today kind of have a choice between importing immigrant labor to take care of the elderly or building centers for the elderly to live abroad where everything is cheaper: land, medical care, and support. It can be $1 trillion difference for countries that are facing budget issues.
Excuse me. Before we close, I'd love to chat a bit about the geopolitics, geoeconomics, and also ecological ramifications of population growth. Let's start with geopolitics. Historically, great powers have often been defined in part by how many soldiers or factory workers they can mobilize. I wonder if you think that remains true today. Is there still a connection, in a sense, between demographic vitality and national power, or in an age of technology, is that increasingly irrelevant?
We're not yet in an age where robot soldiers can take territory on the battlefield. So despite the fact that we have drones and we have missiles, what we're seeing in Ukraine today is that the number of soldiers that can man a front line or defend territory is still critical. So the fact that Russia is a declining population, that China is a rapidly declining population, means their days are numbered as great powers. I think they know it, which is why they're acting out of desperation today.
What about the shape of the world economy? Presumably, these big demographic shifts will influence future patterns of innovation, trade, and growth. I wonder if, looking back at history, you see anything, any lessons there about where tomorrow's dynamism will come from and what its implications might be for the way the engines of growth are situated around the world, or how the world economy is organized?
Well, that is the multi-trillion-dollar question: is where is economic growth going to come from in the future? Now, let me simply say, we can't have more growth without going to a clean energy economy without wrecking the planet. That's not so much a matter of population growth as how we feed and provide heat and light for the growing population. Even if population growth stopped tomorrow, the fact that we have 5 or 6 billion poor people who are going to get lighting, transportation, and heating, and a more meat-intensive diet means we need to find ways to do that with clean energy to save the planet. So in a sense, population growth is not the key, it's how we do it. That said, we still need economic growth to simply provide a stable or growing standard of living for the 8 billion people that we have and for the 10 billion that we're inevitably going to have. How do we do that? Well, here's again what people don't really understand. In 1950, which is when most of our global international security and international economic institutions were created, right, in the wake of World War II. That was the big global institution building period that brought us the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations. At that time, the prime working age population of North America and Europe was very large and fast growing. About 30% of the world's workers in 1950 were in the US, Canada, and Europe. And that number was on track to nearly double between 1950 and 2010. That was the world we got used to. That's the world we're accustomed to thinking about. But the next 50 years are going to be completely different. In the next 50 years, the number of prime working age people in Europe and North America is going to decline. Instead of nearly doubling, it's going to go down by about 10%. Meanwhile, the number of young workers is exploding elsewhere. So in 1950, about 30% of the world's workers were in Europe. And as they got more productive and provided output, the world economy could grow. By comparison, Africa and South Asia combined at that time had actually a slightly fewer number of workers. By 2050, it's totally upside down. By 2050, less than 10% of the world's prime age workers will be in North America and Europe. More than half, 55%, will just be in South Asia and Africa. And that's by 2050, more than half the world's prime workforce will be in South Asia and Africa. And less than 10% will be in Europe. What does that mean? It means that the productivity of the great majority of the world's workers 30 years from now will depend on how young people today in South Asia and Africa are getting educated to be productive in the future. If that fails to happen, if large numbers of the people currently in Africa and South Asia don't get a good secondary education, much less a good college education, average productivity for the world is just going to plummet in the next 30 years. And this, I think, is the big picture about global population that people are just not seeing. They think China will continue to give us growth or that India will give us growth, and that's wrong. It's really the young people today in Africa and the larger portion of South and Southeast Asia. That's going to be where we have to focus our hopes for growth in the future. And that will mean an effort to improve the work skills, secondary education for that population. And unfortunately, today, they're way behind the world average.
Jack, we've obviously covered a huge amount of ground in this conversation. It's often said, as the hoary cliche has it, that demography is destiny. But actually, something you've made quite clear is that nothing is written in the stars. Human agency and policy choices will help determine what a world of 8 billion and counting actually means, what it looks like in the future for all of us. Many thanks, Jack, for your observations today. I look forward to hosting you when we hit 9 billion.
Well, that'll be a real pleasure for me, too. I'm certainly hoping to be around here to see that.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jack.
Thank you, Stewart.
Well, thanks for listening to The World Unpacked, brought to you by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and please don't forget to rate and subscribe. The World Unpacked is produced by Cliff Jayapranata and Clarissa Guerrero and edited by our audio engineer, Tim Martin. Catch you next time.